Mystery. At all times, it lingers around us, whispering in the depths of understanding, calling us to lean in further, to explore more, to ask the big questions. Faith and fact, certainty and the unknown. Can they dance with one another to not be at odds? Revealing the divine mystery at work in creation and embedded in all of existence. Unfolding that which is not seen, but always has been. I wonder.
How many of you love a good origin story? Maybe the Marvel Universe is where you go when you want a good drama about how a superhero came to be. Or maybe you're more of a sports fan, so a 30 for 30 on ESPN is more your thing. The thing about origin stories is they answer questions that have been left unanswered. They connect the dots between things that didn't seem related. They become puzzle pieces to a much bigger story. For the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about some of the questions that cause us to wonder, specifically how God and science relate to one another, and how to still live with a sense of wonder and curiosity as we try to make sense of the world around us. So, think about it like building a tower. When you build a tower of blocks, there are certain parts that matter more to the structure than others. Like when you're playing Jenga, those pieces at the top, you can take them off with no problem. The pieces in the middle, you can gently work them out, but those bottom pieces are really tricky because they make up the foundation of the whole structure. When you're building something, it's important to make sure that what goes on the bottom is strong enough to hold everything else, that the necessary pieces are in place. In the same way, when it comes to our understanding of the world around us, when it comes to our faith, we want to make sure that it's all built on something solid. We want to make sure that the most important parts of the story are where they belong, so that when there are parts that we encounter that might confuse us or not make a lot of sense, we can be sure that we have a foundation for a tower and that the story holds. A foundation that makes sense, that we can build our faith on. The question we need to ask ourselves is, when we come to the end of this series, what foundation are you building your faith on? What holds it up? I think for a lot of us, it's these three things. Bible stories. Here's what I mean by that. Our faith matters because the Bible tells us it should. We believe in Jesus because we trust what the Bible says about him. Maybe we're inspired by stories like David and Goliath or Noah and the Ark. Maybe we've heard these stories for as long as we can remember, so we just assume that we should believe them. Bible stories make up the bottom layer of our tower. The second thing is other people's expectations. For others of us, if we were really honest, we would admit that we're here because it's just what other people expect us to do. You may still be debating what you believe, but you know it's important to your mom or your dad or your grandma that you show up. So you show up for them. You've built your faith on the fact that other people say it's important. And it's not worth creating conflict by leaving your faith when you care so deeply about what those people think. And the third one is tragedy or trauma in your life. Maybe the foundation of your faith was some sort of tragedy or trauma where you felt like you needed God. And it helped you through a really difficult time. But you've gotten through it, and now the more you think about it, the more you wonder if maybe faith was something that worked for a time, but doesn't make a whole lot of sense for you anymore. Maybe you feel like you've outgrown it. So, for a lot of you, you go through school with a faith either built on stories in the Bible, the traditions passed down by your family, or circumstances that you've been through. And for many of us, that works for a long time. But here's the problem. What happens when that layer just doesn't hold up anymore? What happens when science bumps up against the stories that we read in the Bible, or the faith that's been passed down to us from our parents and grandparents? What happens when that bottom layer doesn't intersect with real life problems anymore? If the building blocks of your faith are stories in the Bible or the fact that other people believe, what happens when a classmate or a college professor or a boss challenges what you believe? If someone brings solid evidence to suggest that the stories you believe are false or the traditional beliefs of the people closest to you are outdated, will you hit a crisis in your faith? Will the entire tower just crumble? I think the odds are that it's possible. I think that's why more than half of students walk away from their faith after they finish high school, because their bottom row of blocks wasn't strong enough to handle what life threw at them. And if someone can disprove your foundation, all of the faith that you've built on top comes crashing down. Here's the good news, though. It doesn't have to be this way. Science isn't the enemy, even though it sometimes asks questions that our faith doesn't have answers for. That's okay. We can build our faith on a foundation that will stand up to any argument or any evidence that science presents. Even better, we can take what science says and not see it as a threat to the building blocks of our faith. We can build our faith on a foundation that has stood for 2,000 years and was actually intended to be the foundation of every Christian's faith from the very beginning. So, what should that bottom block be? What is our foundation? To find out, we're going to look back in time at something that happened 2,000 years ago. Jesus, the one that Christianity is based around, lived and then died by crucifixion on a Roman cross. He was killed for disrupting the systems and structures the Roman and religious authorities had in place. He claimed to be God and then said and did things that the religious leaders couldn't imagine God would say or do, because Jesus lifted people that were normally looked down on. He included people that were normally excluded. He loved and valued people that were typically looked over and passed by. That wasn't how the world worked back then. And for the leaders who were used to having the power and the final say, they felt their position of power was threatened and Jesus had to be stopped. So they made a plan to arrest him, have him beaten, and then killed. The crazy thing about it is, Jesus didn't put up a fight. He went into Jerusalem when he knew that there were plots made to have him arrested. He didn't argue or defend his case. He didn't hurl insults at the soldiers or leaders falsely accusing him. He took it all on, and then he died, forgiving them in the process. As the Son of God, Jesus could have made it all stop, but he didn't. He allowed that to happen because he was the perfect representation of what God was like. Being willing to die when he had done nothing wrong and then forgiving the people who did it to him showed us exactly what God was like. Love, compassion, mercy, forgiveness. So Jesus died on the cross and then was placed in a tomb. Even though it was a surprise that religious leaders were willing to kill him, his death itself wasn't a surprise. Every religious and political leader died eventually, but Jesus' story was different, which is what makes Christianity different. According to one of Jesus' closest friends, Matthew, some of the women were heading to Jesus' tomb after his death, most likely to give him a proper burial following the crucifixion. Then Matthew tells us what happens next. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning. His clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay." Matthew 28, 2-6. Maybe you've gotten used to this story because you've heard it so much growing up, but try to imagine what it must have felt like for the women who were at the tomb. They had an angel show up and tell them that what had happened with every other dead person wasn't true with Jesus. He didn't stay dead. He resurrected. You don't have to be a scientific genius to know that things like this aren't supposed to happen, but it did. And since this event, more than 2,000 years ago, the Christian faith has been built on the foundation of the resurrection. That's the most important building block. One of the most famous Christians of all time, Paul, said in a letter to the church in Corinth, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." 1 Corinthians 15:14. In other words, Without the resurrection, everything we believe is pointless. Going from death to life is what gives us the point of what and why we believe. Paul didn't say, if the earth wasn't made in 6 days, our preaching is useless and so is our faith. He didn't say, if Jonah wasn't swallowed by an actual fish, or if Noah wasn't on an actual ark, or if Adam and Eve didn't have a conversation with an actual snake, our faith is useless. He didn't say that because those aren't the building blocks of our faith. Because whether science said the earth was made in 6 days or 6 billion years ago, it doesn't really affect our faith at all, because that isn't the point. What happened on a cross and the days following and what that event represents, that's what matters most. As you continue to prioritize the foundation of your faith, here's what I want you to do. Build your faith on what matters most. As you prioritize what matters most when it comes to your faith in your future, focus on the main thing. The bottom block of your faith should be the resurrection of Jesus. Here's what's cool about this. Hundreds of people said that they saw Jesus with their own eyes after he came back to life. There are multiple accounts of people who wrote down what they saw later. Jesus' closest friends and even his brother James were tortured, and many were killed because they refused to deny that they saw the risen Jesus. Jesus started out as this humble nobody raised in a small town on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. And within a matter of a couple hundred years, the empire had fallen, and the teachings of Jesus had changed the world. Even people who don't believe Jesus is the Son of God are living in a world that he changed. Because of Jesus, people started to see the value of individual lives and not just people in power. Because of Jesus, the idea that there could be a good God who made a good world didn't seem like a strange thought. Because of Jesus, history changed direction. The first followers of Jesus who saw the crucifixion, heard about the resurrection, and then changed their lives in the culture they lived in as a result, they understood something. The resurrection was a real event that changed the world and the way we see the world. It's that building block, when made into the foundation, that changes everything. We join a long line of people who place their faith in Jesus because of the resurrection. So let me ask again, what is the foundation of your faith? I want to challenge you to do 2 things with everything we've talked about today. Number 1, don't walk away from faith unnecessarily. Maybe you've been wrestling with what we've been talking about. Maybe there's a Bible story or a passed down belief that doesn't add up for you. Maybe you've learned something in science class that is really tough to argue with, and you think it has the potential to topple everything you believe. If you build your faith on the resurrection, that doesn't have to be the case. You can ask questions, wrestle with scientific evidence, and still keep your faith in place. Number 2, build your faith on what matters most. Your faith in Jesus is based on what he did so many years ago with the evidence of hundreds of witnesses and friends who died defending what they saw. Not only that, you're living in a world that has been completely turned upside down because of Jesus. Culture shifted to reflect what Jesus said was true about people, meaning that when you head into your future, your faith can stand on the foundation of the resurrection that changed the world, that changed history, and that changed individual lives, no matter what challenges science or anyone else presents. When you build your faith on what matters most, you will build a faith that lasts. Science can't explain the person of Jesus, the life he lived, and the resurrection that he pulled off. But that's what matters most.